1942 did not start well for the Wehrmacht. Overextended in the Great Summer Invasion of Russia, German armies had been checked for the first time in the last month of 1941. Beaten back by fierce Soviet counterattacks from Leningrad to the Crimea, Hitler's war machine was slowly freezing to a standstill. After being driven from the gates of Moscow, most of the generals who had made Blitzkrieg possible had been dismissed by the Führer. The former corporal had taken direct command of the armed forces. Hitler refused to consider mere consolidation of 1941's huge territorial gains. He promised the German people that this year, 1942, they would triumph. Moscow was no longer the key. The massed panzer and infantry formations were to drive southwestwards. They would seize the city of Stalingrad, a strategic city to be sure, but made even more important in Hitler's eyes because it was named after his hated rival, Joseph Stalin. From there, they would be within striking distance of the real prize, the vital oil fields in the Caucasus. But the Wehrmacht's panzers were running short of fuel. Materially, Hitler's armies were dangerously depleted after the headlong advance of Operation Barbarossa, and losses from the fierce battles of the winter were far from being made good. And Stalin also had something to prove. In January 1942, 12 German armies were locked in combat with 22 Soviet armies. On a front stretching from the Crimea to the Gulf of Finland, 141 divisions, including 11 from Axis allies, faced more than 300 Russian formations. The very size of the war zone was in the Wehrmacht's favor. Stalin was trying not only to relieve Moscow and Leningrad, but also to destroy Army Group Center. His generals knew what happened to commanders who failed, and Red Army offensives were launched all along the line. It was too much. Despite tattered uniforms stuffed with straw and newspaper, weapons that jammed in the Arctic temperatures, and a grave lack of tanks or aircraft, the German army defended itself with extraordinary professionalism and courage. The fighting conditions were appalling and favored the Soviets, used to the rigors of the Russian winter. As the petrol froze in their fuel tanks, the Germans came to place greater reliance on horse-drawn transport. But as the winter drew on, they succeeded in stemming the Russian hordes. The stubborn German defense revealed the Red Army's lack of experience. Its problems exacerbated by shortages of all kinds. By March, even Stalin had to admit that his great offensive was over. Stalin's failure to relieve besieged Leningrad appeared to have doomed the city. Since Hitler had ordered that the cradle of the Bolshevik Revolution be leveled, it seemed only a matter of time before it fell. Its population swollen to over 3 million by refugees flooding into the city, Leningrad was cut off by Germans to the south, and to the north by the Finns, eager to avenge the Winter War. Communist Party chiefs anxiously calculated their food reserves. On the 1st of November, they realized there was only enough food for another week. And with winter approaching, there was so little fuel that buildings could not be heated. Electricity was rationed to an hour a day. What followed was the most appalling siege in history. A long, drawn-out agony in which nearly 1 million men, women and children died of cold and slow starvation. 3 times the total war dead suffered by Britain or the USA in the whole of World War II. The German army made no attempt to storm the city. With unintercepted reconnaissance flights, the Germans trained their artillery with increasing accuracy on the Soviet defenses. The bombardment was ceaseless. Hunger and the bitter winter weather did the rest. Only the barest of supplies reached the embattled population, being brought across the frozen ice of Lake Lagoda during the winter or through the German lines. For the Germans themselves, conditions were severe. The ground was iron hard and could only be encouraged to move with the liberal use of dynamite. But throughout the winter and into the spring, they kept a relentless grip on the city, stopping all Soviet attempts to break through. The fluid fighting of early 1942 isolated numerous pockets of the invaders. The Soviet Northwest Front broke through in the Valdai Hills, encircling several divisions in turn. In each case, the trapped German troops were clustered around an airfield. With the Luftwaffe flying in supplies, they continued to defend their perimeters until relief was at hand, or, as in the case of General von Seydlitz's 6 divisions at Demyansk, broke out. Seydlitz's men took a month to battle their way to safety across the snow. Their epic escape was sustained by parachute drops and an iron determination never to surrender. In the euphoria that greeted their escape, the German High Command overlooked the physical state of the survivors. Months of combat on the frozen steppe, with inadequate rations, medical and sanitary facilities, had left many men unfit for further service. The Germans also drew the comforting conclusion that they could keep encircled units supplied by air. It was an assumption that would be tested to destruction within a year. The spring thaw halted operations. The Rasputitsa turned the steel-hard ground into impenetrable rivers of mud. Nothing could move, and the Germans were given the chance to breathe again. With the Wehrmacht still less than 300 kilometers from Moscow, a distance the panzer divisions could cover in a week, the Soviets concentrated their forces around the capital. It was the obvious military strategy, and it was wrong. The Wehrmacht's High Command calculated that over the entire Eastern Front, the Germans had lost 376,000 men killed and wounded during the Soviet winter offensive. Nearly double that number had been lost from frostbite and sickness. At the beginning of April 1942, the armies in the East were considerably under strength. However, they had inflicted over 400,000 casualties on their enemies, and many soldiers puzzled over the Red Army's ability to take such punishment. What the Soviets lacked in military skill, they seemed determined to make up for with fanatical and often futile bravery. Goebbels damned them as mindless automata, an enduring image that survived long after 1945. But in its counter-offensive, the Red Army had learned the true nature of its opponents. The ordinary Russian soldier discovered that the most outlandish atrocity tales fed to them by the commissars were not so incredible after all. In their retreat, the Germans had ruthlessly enforced a scorched earth policy. In village after village, liberated by the Soviets, they uncovered grisly evidence of German savagery. Buildings had been torched, livestock killed, women and children driven out into the snow to die or summarily dispatched. The merest hint of resistance triggered acts of hideous barbarity, and it was one 18-year-old girl's fate to symbolize the partisan war that winter. Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya came from the Moscow Komsomol, Soviet youth movement, and was caught setting fire to German stables in the village of Petryshevo. Paraded through the streets with a placard around her neck, she was tortured, then hanged. Zoya became a national heroine. Her fate, so typical of that meted out by the German army, became a rallying cry to the Russian people. Ordinary Russian peasants had initially treated the Germans as liberators, but any goodwill was quickly squandered. Large numbers of Russians took refuge in the forests and the steppes, where they joined the partisan armies fighting a no-quarter war with the occupiers. It was a brutal conflict, fought without any human feeling. It has been estimated that the partisans in the period 1941 to 1945 killed, wounded, or captured 1.5 million members of the German and Axis forces. 21,000 troop and supply trains were derailed, 12,000 bridges were brought down, and 1,100 aircraft destroyed at German airfields. For the coming campaigning season, Hitler needed to make good his losses. He demanded his allies make up the numbers. Romania and Italy supplied 500,000 men that year. By German standards, they were poorly equipped and often badly trained, so they were mainly used to hold quiet sectors while the German formations led the attacks. By replacing German civilian laborers with slaves seized from Eastern Europe, stripping battalions from divisions garrisoning Western Europe, and calling up the next year's conscription class a year early, the Wehrmacht was able to assemble 2.7 million men on the Russian front. This accretion of strength could not be repeated, so Hitler was betting everything on one roll of the die. In material too, the Germans were making considerable improvements, although even now the home economy was not on a total war footing. The production of light tanks was halted, and medium tanks were given heavier armor and bigger guns. The Panzer IV was equipped with a long-barrel 75mm weapon, which had previously proved itself with the infantry in an anti-tank role. By so doing, the Germans to some extent overcame the nightmare posed by the appearance of the superb Soviet T-34. At the same time, the increased number of cross-country vehicles allowed the Panzergrenadier infantry to follow more closely behind the tanks, and so exploit their successes. Thanks to the light armor and cannon fitted to their half-tracks, the troops were able to do some of their fighting without leaving their vehicles. Even so, it is important to remember that the Wehrmacht still placed considerable reliance upon horse-drawn transport. The Wehrmacht Panzer and motorized divisions had also begun to receive quantities of infantry support weapons, anti-tank guns, and even conventional artillery fitted onto tracked chassis. The infantry also acquired a new machine gun, the MG-42, capable of cutting down the most determined of infantry attacks, its hysterical shriek delivering death at 1,000 rounds per minute. To these innovations were added the fearsome batteries of rocket launchers or Nebelwerfer. It fired salvos of 30-kilo high-explosive rockets over 7,000 meters, wreaking devastation on its target. However, all through the winter of 1941-42, hundreds of kilometers from the front, another army was laboring under impossible conditions. As the USSR's key industrial regions were overrun by the invaders, whole factories were uprooted and shipped to the Urals, to the deserts of Kazakhstan, or the frozen tundra of Siberia. Over 1.5 million wagon loads made the journey, and workers, many of them women, struggled to set up machine tools literally in the middle of nowhere. Not only did they get the factories working again, but they did so with unbelievable speed. The Yak fighter plant in Moscow was dismantled and taken to Siberia, where production resumed in only a week. By early 1942, it was built building more aircraft per month than it had done on its original site. From a far inferior base, Russia produced only a quarter as much steel as Germany. The Soviets were already outbuilding the invaders, supplying their armies with more tanks, guns and aircraft than the Wehrmacht was receiving. In Directive number 41, dated April the 5th, Hitler stated, "The enemy has suffered enormous losses of men and material. In attempting to exploit their apparent initial successes, they have exhausted during this winter the mass of their reserves, which were intended for later operations." In this mistaken belief, Hitler set out his objectives for the coming summer offensive, codenamed Operation Blau. He set his revitalized armies, now numbering some 215 divisions, the task of destroying the last remaining enemy formations, and as far as possible, capturing the main sources of raw materials on which their war economy depended. All available forces were to be concentrated on the southern sector. Their mission was firstly to annihilate the enemy on the Don. Then they were to swing north and take Stalingrad, followed by a combined assault to conquer the Caucasus oil areas. Without that oil, German panzers would go nowhere. Lastly, they were to capture the passes through the Caucasus Mountains, giving access to the Middle East. Hitler was not the only dictator planning a knockout blow. The return of warmer weather was the signal for Stalin to order another Soviet offensive, but the attempt to recapture Kharkov failed dismally. 10 days and nights of hectic thrust and counter-thrust in open country turned into a masterclass in blitzkrieg. The advancing Russians were outmaneuvered by the superbly coordinated German air and ground forces. The Luftwaffe air fleets under Ritter von Greim dominated the skies. Swarms of Ju-88s, Heinkel 111s and Stukas pounded the Russian positions. The bombers were protected by the world's most experienced fighter pilots, which had been reinforced by Germany's Axis allies. 3 Russian armies were surrounded and annihilated. Marshal Timoshenko was summoned to Moscow to explain the loss of another 200,000 men. As the German 6th and 17th Armies shattered the Russian offensive at Kharkov, the 11th Army, under the command of General Erich von Manstein, broke through the heavily fortified Soviet positions on the Kerch Peninsula. By April 1942, the Soviets had ferried 250,000 men into the Crimea, together with considerable tank and artillery support. But as in the previous year, the forces were committed piecemeal against overwhelming German opposition. At dawn on May the 8th, Manstein crossed the Kamenskoye Isthmus to assault the positions covering Kerch. The 9 German divisions were outnumbered 2 to 1. Russians were poorly placed, and as usual the Germans placed their strongest forces at the weakest point in the enemy's front line. The sheer weight of German metal forced the Soviets back from Feodosia. The panzers, supported by screaming Stukas, then drove through the waist of the peninsula towards Kerch itself. Between the 15th and the 20th of May, the Caucasus front imploded, and the Soviets were driven into the Black Sea. They left behind 170,000 prisoners, 1,138 guns, and 258 tanks. Not wishing to belittle his victory, Manstein described his enemy in his memoirs in much more moderate terms than did the Soviet High Command, which vigorously criticized their bad positioning, inertia, and lack of communication between air and land forces. With its flank protected, 11th Army doubled back to storm Sevastopol, home of the Soviet Black Sea Fleet. Manstein had received strong reinforcements. To oppose the Russian garrison of 106,000 sailors, soldiers and marines, he could call on 204,000 men, 720 tanks, 600 aircraft, 670 guns and 450 mortars. including the Wehrmacht's General Reserve of siege artillery. Armageddon preceded the assault on the fortress. Operations commenced with a 5-day barrage, which reminded some older members of the army staff of their done 25 years before. Manstein's experts used every piece of artillery they could bring to bear. Included in the heavy artillery pounding the Russian positions was the massive Karl, a siege mortar with a caliber of 60 centimeters and the largest gun ever made, the 80-centimeter Gustav railway gun. Built originally to breach the Maginot Line, Gustav weighed over 1,300 tons. It was carried by 25 special trains and took up to 6 weeks to assemble on a specially prepared site. Over 1,000 men under the control of a German army engineer unit dug through a small knoll to form a wide railway cutting, whose sides were raised to provide cover and protection for the gun. A further 500 men manned the weapon in action. Its shells weighed up to 10 tons, and simply getting each shell and propellant charge to the breech was a major task. Projectile and charge then had to be rammed accurately, and the whole barrel elevated to the correct firing angle. It all took time, and while the best firing rate was 1 round every 15 minutes, in practice it was more like 1 shell per hour. The gun had a maximum range of around 40 kilometers, and all shots were observed by a special flight of Fiesler Stork spotter planes. One target after another was demolished by the gun, which pulverized Soviet coastal batteries, including the Molotov and Maxim Gorky forts, and the supposedly invulnerable underwater magazine beneath Severnaya Bay. The Luftwaffe also played its part, dropping more than 20,000 tons of bombs on Sevastopol in 3 weeks, more than it dropped on the whole of England during the Blitz. After the barrage, the German 54th Corps moved against the defences. The Soviets defended every yard of territory through the first weeks of June, demonstrating a tenacity which would be repeated to resounding effect at Stalingrad later that year. As one of Manstein's NCOs commented, "Don't believe Ivan is dead just because his legs have been blown off, his scalp is torn off by shrapnel, and somebody has stuck a bayonet in his guts. If he has an arm left and a rifle within reach, he'll shoot you in the back as soon as you pass him." By the 3rd week, Manstein was sufficiently worried not only to throw in his last reserves, but also to beg for reinforcements from the 17th Army. The Soviet Navy continued to perform miracles in resupplying Sevastopol across the Black Sea. This supply route had become a killing ground for the Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine as they intercepted the vital transports. But the relief efforts were born of desperation, and eventually the sheer weight of material thrown against the Soviet defenses began to tell. The Germans finally breached the defenses on the night of the 28th-29th of June. During the next 3 days, the Soviets organized a Dunkirk-style evacuation to rescue as many as possible of the men, women and children who had survived the 250-day siege. The Germans had won, but were left with a gutted city, its buildings destroyed. Although von Manstein was awarded a Field Marshal's baton for taking Sevastopol, his 11th Army was so depleted that he would have to leave the drive on Stalingrad to the unimaginative but hugely ambitious General Paulus. Paulus, a staff officer with little operational command experience, knew exactly where his fame and fortune were to be made, and that was at Stalingrad. On the 28th of June, The great summer offensive began. Army Group B, under Field Marshal Theodor von Bock, attacked on a 150-kilometer front. The spearhead was General Hoth's 4th Panzer Army. Paulus's 6th Army extended the front a further 80 kilometers to the south. 2 days later, Army Group A, under Siegmund List, burst over the Donets Bend and drove southwards to Proletskaya and the Caucasus. The attacks were resoundingly successful. Hoth was in Voronezh by July the 3rd, though progress was not fast enough to satisfy Hitler, and he replaced von Bock by Baron Maximilian von Weichs. Army Group B then poured down the Donetsk corridor to link up with von Kleist's armor pushing on Rostov. It seemed that the days of easy victory had returned. The Russian forces were contemptuously swept aside. For the first time in many months, the ground favored large-scale sweeping maneuvers. Hundreds of miles of open rolling corn and steppe grass offered perfect country for the massed legions of German armor. Their advance was visible for miles. Smoke from burning villages and dust kicked up by thousands of heavy vehicles signaled the irresistible onrush of a perfectly functioning war machine. But then Hitler became too ambitious. He believed that the Russians were finished and just needed one more devastating victory to bring the Soviet edifice down. On July the 13th, aiming at another vast encirclement, he detached Hoth's armor, ordering it to swing southeast to link up with Army Group A's tanks, whose forces were now committed to an intense battle in the streets of Rostov. On July the 23rd, Rostov fell, but failed to yield the hoped-for booty. Stalin had finally learned the lesson of trading space for time, and he allowed his marshals to pull their forces back rather than letting them be fatally surrounded. On the same day, Hitler gave a directive which arguably cost him the war in the East, and with it sealed his empire's fate. Totally underestimating the opposing forces, he changed the plans for his 2 army groups. Rather than take Stalingrad and then attack the Caucasus, he opted to move on both objectives simultaneously. He compounded the error by making ruinous reductions in the forces available to the operations. The strategic reserve was sent to the Four Winds. 9th and 11th Panzer Divisions were assigned to General von Kluge. Großdeutschland Division was sent to Army Group Center. Liebstandarte was ordered to France, and the rested 11th Army was held back from taking part in the Caucasus Drive. One General Staff member was to write, "This July the 23rd must be considered as the day it became clear that the German Supreme Command abandoned standard principles of warfare to adopt peculiar new practices stemming rather from Adolf Hitler's irrational and diabolical power than from methodical and realistic military approaches. Once again, history proved that faith in the devil triumphed over reason." But for the moment, everything still seemed to be going Hitler's way. The headlong advance across open country to the Volga was spearheaded by the 6th Army, a veteran formation led in Poland and France by General von Reichenau, one of Hitler's strongest supporters in the Wehrmacht. A vocal anti-Semite, von Reichenau left his soldiers in no doubt as to their historic mission to slaughter Asiatic inferiors, fighting talk that won him command of Army Group South when Hitler sacked von Rundstedt in December 1941. He did not live long to enjoy his promotion to Field Marshal, dying of a stroke soon afterwards. But his influence permeated the army he had led to victory for 2 years. The 6th Army cut a swathe of destruction across Russia as it smashed its way east. The only problems for the Germans were those of traffic control, as both Kleist and Hoth's panzers arrived at the crossing of the Donets simultaneously. In a series of acrimonious arguments, Kleist made it clear that he saw no reason why another panzer army should be assigned to take the Caucasus. To prove the point, he speeded up his own pace once across the river and captured Proletskaya. But to the north, the advance had stagnated. Von Weichs had been left only with the 6th Army to break through the Soviet forces barring the way to Stalingrad. He was forced to delay to await the arrival of the Italian 8th Army, and lack of fuel stopped him employing all his armor at any one time. Hitler relented, and sensing that Hoth's panzers were doing more harm than good in the overcrowded roads south of the Don, he returned the forces to Army Group B on the 30th of July. By that stage, Hoth was already 140 kilometers south of Semlyansk, and strong Soviet forces were preventing a link-up with Paulus. As Hoth's panzers fought their way north, they were slowly being ground down. Nevertheless, 6th Army reached the banks of the Volga on the 23rd of August. In spite of furious Soviet counterattacks, a defensive line was established upstream of Stalingrad. That night, Stalingrad was subjected to an air raid reminiscent of the heaviest London Blitz. The bulk of the bombs dropped were incendiaries, and the wooden buildings of the city burned in a spectacular holocaust. Acres of Stalingrad had been reduced to charred ashes, and it was evident to the thoroughly satisfied German observers that only the main factories and stone-built offices remained for the attention of the German artillery. His left flank secured, von Paulus finally managed to link up with Hoth on the 2nd of September. An assault on the city was now planned, but it was to prove an infinitely more difficult task now that Stalingrad's defenders had time to prepare its defenses. In the meantime, Army Group A had been making excellent progress. 6 months after they had endured winter temperatures of minus 30 degrees centigrade, German soldiers found themselves on the Kuban steppe, where the thermometer topped 50 degrees centigrade in the shade. Inside the tanks of 1st Panzer Army, the heat was simply unbearable. Field Marshal List's major worries were about supplies. It was impossible to satisfy the needs of 26 advancing divisions, some moving southwest, some south, and some southeast. So much so that Colonel General von Kleist suggested, "No Russians in front of us, no supplies behind us." Jerry cans of petrol dropped from Ju-52 transports had to be brought up to the panzers by camel transport. The terrain slowed up fighting troops as well as supplies. Roads were rivers of dust, and the rivers were wide with unpredictable currents. Nevertheless, SS Viking Division forced the River Kuban in the face of intense resistance early in August. On August the 9th, Ruperov, 17th Army and 3rd Romanian Army under General Vikadrov occupied simultaneously the port of Yeysk on the Sea of Azov, Krasnodar on the Kuban, and the blazing wreckage of the oil town of Maikop. Maikop's oil wells were so thoroughly sabotaged that they would not return to use until 4 years after the war. Shimmering in the distance like a layer of cloud, the Caucasus Mountains could be seen from over 100 kilometers away. On the 9th of August, 1st Panzer Army took Pyatigorsk at the bottom of the first foothills of the Caucasus. And on the left, patrols were sent out towards Astrakhan. On the 21st of August, a detachment of the elite 1st and 4th Gebirgsjäger mountain regiments planted the swastika flag on the 5,642-meter summit of Mount Elbrus. The rest of 49th Mountain Corps advanced into the subtropical forests skirting Sukhumi in Georgia. On the eastern side of the mountains, the river Terek was the last obstacle facing Panzergruppe Kleist on its breakneck advance. Eventually the offensive reached what Clausewitz called the falling-off point, beyond which wear and tear take over from the initial drive and energy. Russian resistance was stiffening, and the German forces were now hundreds of kilometers past the last railheads. A desperate race followed, both sides hurrying forward ammunition, fuel, spare parts, and more soldiers, always more soldiers, for one final battle before the Rasputitsa imposed nature's halt on campaigning. Hitler, exasperated by the slow progress, removed List and took control of operations himself. But all the genius and dynamism with which he credited himself were unable to improve matters. With hindsight, it seems that Hitler may have been attempting the impossible. But Stalin was sufficiently alarmed by the series of reverses since the fall of Kerch to issue a famous order of the day on the 28th of July. Every inch of territory we concede strengthens the enemy and weakens the defense of our country. If we do not stop the retreat, we shall be left with no grain, fuel, metal, workshops, factories or railways. Therefore, the moment has come to stop the retreat. Not another step back. Cowards and panic-mongers will be executed on the spot. Henceforth, every commander, soldier and political officer must be subject to iron discipline. Not a step back unless ordered by the Supreme Commander. In Stalingrad, the order had the desired effect. The town had 500,000 inhabitants, and much of the civilian population had been marched out to dig trenches and anti-tank ditches. But that was not the only German worry. German intelligence had not warned the units taking part that Stalingrad sprawled for more than 30 kilometers along the Volga, and that in places the western edge of the city was more than 8 kilometers from the bank of the river. The time for taking the city by coup de main had passed. Von Paulus's makeshift attack could only have succeeded if it met an enemy that was not only beaten, but whose morale was extremely low. From the very first engagements in the increasingly bitter street fighting, it was clear to the Germans that the Russians had recovered beyond anyone's expectations, and that the Russian slogan, "The Volga has only one bank," was no empty boast. On the 16th of September, Colonel General von Richthofen, now commander of Luftflotte 4, complained of the lack of spirit in the 6th Army. He wrote in his diary, "With a little effort, the town should fall in 2 days." Less than a week later, he noted with more justification. September the 22nd. In the town itself, progress is desperately slow. The 6th Army will never finish the job at this rate. Above all, because it is threatened from the north by the Russians, and because reinforcements arrive only in dribs and drabs. We have to fight endless engagements, taking one cellar after another in order to gain any ground at all. The Russian soldiers, spurred on by patriotic propaganda, were now fighting in circumstances in which their own natural talents were an advantage, and their lack of armor and mobility did not matter. They fought from holes burrowed in rubble, from the blackened caverns of burnt-out offices, from behind parapets of gaunt towering blocks. They fought for every yard of every street and every alleyway in the city. Here, all the panzers could do was to creep over the wasteland of a city devastated by their own efforts. Unable to see the hidden enemy, their fate was to be blasted by liquid fire or their tracks blown off by grenade. Armored vehicles are virtually defenseless once immobilized, and once the tanks were stopped, German infantry were mown down by machine gun fire as they sought protection behind their vehicles. In Berlin, Hitler was already proclaiming the victory in Stalingrad, and poured as many reinforcements as possible into the inferno. By contrast, the Russians fed in just enough troops to keep the Germans occupied and to resist their best efforts. In the meantime, the mass of men and arms accumulating in reserve were being held back for a different purpose. This was finally revealed on the 19th of November. The last of 6 major attacks by the 6th Army had been repulsed, and the weary German troops were licking their wounds. Surprise was near total when the Soviets unleashed massive barrages north and south of Stalingrad. The Red Army had finally learned the lessons of Blitzkrieg. This time their attacks would be launched at the weakest part of the German line. On Paulus's thinly held flanks, protected only by Romanian and Italian formations. The battle for Stalingrad had entered a new and desperate phase.